Hi, and welcome to the third part of our podcast series on our seminar series for fall 2023 Authentic Assessment Reimagining What Learning Looks Like. I'm Sean Jackson. I'm an instructional consultant with the Learning Technology Consultants Group within LSA Technology Services. I'm joined today by Caroline Coy, also instructional consultant with the same group. And today we're going to talk a little bit about redefining rigor and flexibility, and talk about how to make rigorous assessments equitable. So, Caroline, if we could start, what kind of preconceptions do instructors have about what rigor entails?
It really is a spectrum. I think some are thinking of rigor in terms of their grade breakdown and trying to measure if they've been rigorous enough by looking at the final grades and making sure there's not too many that are at the top or too many at the bottom. And for others, I think sometimes the amount of work is something that an instructor could use as a checkpoint for if they're being rigorous enough. And that is something that, as we discussed today, we'll probably find is likely a misconception. Maybe not always if these are formative assignments that they're using to help build skills, but amounts of assignments, grade breakdown, um, sometimes the amount of time given. These are some of the things that our team hears when an instructor is trying to check that they've been rigorous.
Right. Oftentimes, it's the difficulty to even accomplish the assessments, right?
Y-
Like, yeah.
Exactly. So, um, is this something that a student would be asked to do out in the field? And that might be very appropriate if they've spent a really long time building toward it, um, or depending on what level they're at, but that's not always the most appropriate measure of rigor.
So then, with all that said, it seems like there's a lot of misconceptions about what rigor should be, can be. Um, if we were to redefine rigor in a specific way, like to think about rigor with a more pedagogical, positive approach, how would we define rigor in that circumstance?
So, one definition that can be really helpful is if you think of rigor as students demonstrating a high level of learning through challenging work. So we'll have to look at what challenging work means and really break down that definition, but seeing it through that lens of what kind of work is really going to challenge students. Um, and then it's going to be challenging, so rigorous courses also provide support, and we're going to look at that as well.
So to kind of follow up with that, I guess then academic rigor would not include things like strict punitive policies or you know attendance, taking off letter grades, things of that nature.
Definitely not. So sometimes if you're trying to understand rigor, um, it's helpful to know how it's misused, and we talked about that a little bit at the start. But one common misconception about rigor is that it's a logistically difficult course. Um, and logistically difficult courses tend to have some strict policies that don't serve learning. An example of a policy like that, like as you mentioned, it might be something like attendance, where students are docked a significant portion of their grade if they miss one class, for example. Um, it might also be if you have a high pressure situation, like you're asking a student to present orally in a class where public speaking skills aren't really part of the learning goals. That puts them in a high pressure situation that makes it more difficult for them to be successful, but it doesn't serve learning. So, those are a few examples. I'd also add to that limited opportunities for support. Um, So again, we talked about an assignment where they have limited time, which also means they're going to have limited opportunities to get help if they need it. And that's a logistical challenge. That's not part of a cognitive challenge. They may not understand something and now they've run out of time in order to address it. And it's important to know that the logistical rigor, it really affects students who are already facing inequities more than maybe a student who doesn't work, who already had an idea of what higher education would look like. They kind of know what we call the hidden curriculum, which is the unspoken rules that you might have in your course. An example of this might be you might have formatting expectations for certain assignments. For the students who are first generation, haven't been exposed to this environment before, a logistically rigorous course is going to really put up barriers when there don't need to be.
So if I can summarize what you're saying here is that one of the misconceptions about what rigor is that is avoiding needlessly complex tasks, right? Or tasks that tax the student in a way that doesn't engage with the learning objectives of the course, right? And so really kind of tying the objectives of the course and the learning objectives to the actual difficulty, right? As opposed to the things that have nothing to do with that.
Exactly. And if I could add to that as well, even if you have a task that you're asking them to do and it does align with the goals, making it too long or too difficult, as we mentioned at the beginning, can also be needless rigor as well. So not just like the actual logistics of the course, but also if your assignment is meeting those learning goals, but they don't need to write a 25-page paper for you to know that they know how to go through the writing process, for example.
Right. Or that they have to spend the entire exam period answering questions, and they'll never be able to finish all the questions, and so it's just about getting a curve, a specific kind of curve to grading on a curve or with a bell curve, right? Is another example of that, where it's kind of needless. Focus on what they actually need to do and have them have a rigorous assessment, right? That's difficult for them to accomplish and shows their deep understanding of the materials, but doesn't tax them or tax the students that have difficulty completing that amount of work in that amount of time, right? That's kind of where we're at, I think, right?
Yeah, and that leads into like what is challenging work.
Absolutely.
Because if you know that the exam that you've set for students is not something that they can finish in the amount of time that they have, or they haven't been able to spend as much time mastering the content, and you know they're not going to do well on certain aspects of that exam, that's not rigorous. That's not measuring what you've taught in the course. So that's a different thing. Challenging work would be that you know you've covered adequately and given students time to master what you've asked them to learn.
Right.
And that's challenging, but you're sure that what you've asked them to do, you've effectively taught and given time for them to do the skill building. So given that, I mean, I know you have a lot to say about challenging work. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you think of that and how you would help someone understand what challenging work is?
Yeah. So I think one of the key parts about thinking about challenging work is that you are challenging the student on their mastery of the objectives and not their like perseverance through the work, right? And so if we had to put like a definition around what challenging work is, it would be a purposeful intellectual difficulty that's designed to deepen mastery and understanding through some sort of practice, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that it's an exam. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a paper. It could be, them creating something. It could be them going through a role playing exercise, or a public speaking opportunity. There's multiple ways to demonstrate that mastery, and the idea is to challenge them to demonstrate that in a high level way, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be taxed mentally or physically to do it, right? It means that they're going to be taxed intellectually to do it, right? And so challenging work pushes students to go beyond just fact retrieval, right? To go into deeper understandings of what they're learning, to understand what they're learning, to be able to analyze things, to be able to create things based off of what they're learning. And one of the interesting uh, one of the interesting things that came out of our research on this part of the seminar series was that I can already hear the critiques of this idea that you need to have that basis of the rote memorization before you can move up to understanding or applying or creating. But the reality is that research has shown that you really don't need to have that foundation. You can go right into the higher order thinking and have students dive into creating or applying the information as they're learning it, and that higher order thinking can start right from the beginning. You don't need that rote memorization to build upon to be able to use the information that they're learning in the course. And with that said, that allows you to have a lot more freedom of creating work that's challenging, to have them apply a lot of their intellectual might into a particular course mastery. So yeah, there's a lot of ways that they could do that. And I also do want to say, as somebody who, if anyone has attended workshops that I've done before, know that I focus on a lot of media projects and a lot of like group media projects. And that doesn't mean that this challenging work is not group media projects. It can be individual projects. It can be multiple choice tests even, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be, high level, video production or podcast production. It can be, the things that you normally do in your course, just with a purposeful intellectual difficulty that goes beyond just fact retrieval.
And I kind of want to talk a little bit more about what you said with Bloom's taxonomy, I believe is what you were referencing, with
Yes.
the foundational knowledge needing to be first, and then you can build up to creation, which is that highest level. But there's a taxonomy that I really love called Fink's taxonomy of learning, and it's all about how to create a significant learning experience. And one thing that is really powerful about it is that there are these circles, and all of them are given equal value. And one of them is foundational knowledge. And then there's also application right next to it. And it's kind of demonstrating visually what you just said. Like the foundational knowledge isn't at the bottom on Fink's taxonomy. It's part of this circle where all of these things need to be happening for students to have a significant learning experience. But the order is going to depend on what they're doing, maybe how they work, what the assignment is. So it's really interesting to think about that, because I think most educators have Bloom's in, they can see it in their brain. It's
Right.
top of mind. So it's hard to get out of that.
Yeah, it's one of the interesting things that's come out of recent years is the idea that a lot of what we have understood to be the ways in which people learn are 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 not as concrete as we imagine them to be. That there's a lot of flexibility that could be had to create new types of projects and to start at a different location than traditional learning objectives have in the past. So I think one of the things we could talk about a little bit here is how instructors would go about developing challenging work, because saying that they need to have a deep understanding of the learning objectives of the course, and then we also need to make sure that it's not logistically difficult. Like that sometimes is a hard leap for some people to make because of what they've learned and how they went through their own college experience, and how traditionally classes have been taught. So what are some ways that we can kind of incorporate that and develop challenging work?
So, your question makes me think about one instructor's course that I've been privileged to work on with the instructor recently. And we came up with the course goals for this course. And one of the goals is for students to critically consume media, or critically evaluate scientific research, specifically on sleep and media use. And the instructor, through reflecting on, what's valuable and how do you teach this, through that conversation, really there was just this aha moment that this instructor had of anything that I teach about sleep research. My own background in it has proven that it's going to be obsolete in 10 years. And that's what it should be as we find out more and as we learn more, and we do better studies. And it just got us both reflecting on what is the value of asking students to understand what something says now versus become critical consumers of something. And so it was more evaluating the value in going through a goal setting process when thinking about your course, because it really gets you to hone in on what's important. And then when you do that process, you realize, well, no multiple choice assessment really can do that with a right or wrong. It's all about what questions do you ask when you're reading something. So how do I evaluate that? And is it that we have some studies every week and then they go through a yes or no, I think this is valid or not, and why, and then I can present my rationale, and you just start thinking creatively about how you're going to get students to do the majority of the thinking, the doing, the writing, and you come up with some really creative ideas. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but that was the first thing that came to mind, because it wasn't like this type of assessment, and there's no easy answer. It's just this process of, once you've identified a really valuable course goal, it has to be specific to your goal, but you're going to discover what doesn't work,
Right.
and get to a really creative place, that probably will lead you to discover that the right answer may not be what's the most important thing in your assessment.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the mindset that instructors would need to be in going into this process of switching to a more challenging work first kind of mentality, right? Of seeing what works, assessing your students' skills, knowledge, buy-in even to what they're being asked to do, and kind of making adjustments from semester to semester to improve things as you go. I think some of the things that definitely do help when trying to understand how to create challenging assignments, or is, of course, it all comes down to some of the basics of good assignment design. Making sure that students clearly understand what their goals are, having students understand why they're doing what they're doing and why it's important. Things like making sure that they know the logistics of what they need to do before they go and do it, so that they know what kind of support that they'll need. Um, Having more open-ended prompts so that students take personal ownership over the research that they're doing. It's things like scaffolding, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
something we can get into a little bit later. But it's
Yeah.
scaffolding is so universally helpful in these situations of creating challenging work, to be able to have these checkpoints and or like breaking down a larger assignment into smaller ones to have students build upon their previous success, right? And of course, obviously, like the other thing is to avoid that checklist effect, right? Of having, too many options or too many questions or too many topics that they have to cover. So it just looks like they're just going down the rubric and making sure that they have everything in their assignment. I do think it's important to know that there's no one silver bullet for solving this issue, that it is going to come down to mindset and to your particular course's objectives and how you can have students demonstrate. For a humanities course, that might mean being able to present a topic through a paper or a presentation. In a STEM class, it might be something completely different. It really depends on what you're willing to do as an instructor and what your students are capable of doing and what the actual topic of the course is.
Yeah, and one thing you mentioned about how we'll look different in different disciplines, um, in STEM courses especially, you tend to think of larger courses sometimes and multiple choice exams. And I was able to sit in on a presentation about team-based learning in the School of Dentistry here at University of Michigan. And they completely changed their whole program from lecture to team-based learning so that it's more focused on challenging work and problem solving and matches more what their students are going to have to do when they leave school. So I thought that was interesting to see not just a course redesign, but a whole different approach to how students were used to going through these dental courses.
That last point you said about how it readies them for their professional life, that is at the core of this, right? Is that when you're working in the field professionally in whatever discipline it is, um, you being able to answer a multiple choice question is not going to help you, right?
Yeah.
But being able to do your own research, being able to express your ideas clearly, being able to demonstrate your problem solving abilities, like that's real. That's the kind of thing that we need to inspire students to do. And with the challenging work here, it helps them build resilience for those times where in the professional world where they're going to have struggles, where they're going to have you know, times where they're struggling professionally and personally at the same time and have to work through it, right? And that might make it easier for them if they've had challenging work earlier in their learning process. And also one of the other things is that is one of the other reasons why challenging work really matters here is that a lot of students come to the university with no plans, right? They come with no majors. They come with no or a vague idea that they're going to apply for med school or law school, but not really a plan for what they want, right? And so if they end up taking a course because they have a mild interest in whatever it is, whether it's anything in LSA you can think of, right? Let's say they have a mild interest in oceanography, right? So they take a course there. If they have some challenging work there that really like challenges them to take ownership over the responsibility of the learning and to deeply understand the course objectives, that might inspire them to make connections between that and what they want to do, or might inspire them to change their direction completely into this new major. And they might find a passion in this way, right? They might find something that really drives them through this work. Whereas if they had a course that was just logistically difficult, but not academically difficult, that might push them away. And so this is a way for students to become inspired to dive more into these topics and to build connections between the different disciplines.
Yeah, and to have a positive experience with learning. I think that logistical rigor, what you mentioned about them being pushed away, like that That has nothing to do probably with the content. It's just kind of a high stress situation many times that can lead someone to say, this isn't for me, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. So one example where where challenging work can really push students to develop a better understanding or to like have a desire for to learn more is a course that I helped out with over the last few years, FTVM 150, where students are asked to make multiple video essays where they develop their argumentation skills to develop um, deep arguments that use the text that they're referring to, and they use evidence and try to also make this be an entertaining piece of 3 or 4 minutes of an essay using clips from the movies that they've seen. And what we've noticed is that like this is an introductory course. Students of all levels take this course. Students who are decided, undecided, in different majors in different colleges take this course because it has a lot of other kind of prereqs, right, that it fits. Uh, and what we found is that a lot of people like come out of this with a real deep appreciation and understanding of the filmmaking process in general, because they're being asked to make these artifacts, right, and to understand the editing process and to understand a deeper understanding of the things that most people consume 2 or 3 hours a day of, a little bit deeper. And what we found is that this class in particular has really helped increase enrollment in that discipline, and also inspire people to bring that idea to their other courses and in other disciplines. And so when it come that student who took FDVM 150 2 semesters later has a course that has an open assignment where they can choose the type of assignment they're going to do. They may choose a video assignment because they've had a little bit of experience and they want to bring those two disciplines together, right? As an example of where a piece of challenging work can really drive people to make connections and inspire them. So now that we have an idea of what rigor is, and what challenging work is defined as, let's talk a little bit about how that functions in a course and how we can think about the equity that we can instill in these courses now that we've had more challenging work. What other work do we need to do to make sure that students succeed in these courses? Do you have any top line kind of thoughts about this?
Well, you had mentioned scaffolding earlier in our conversation, and I think that is really important if you're going to be designing challenging work, because even if you've eliminated all logistical rigor and you've got nothing extraneous, needlessly stressing out your students, you're still asking students to do something that's very difficult. And they're going to come in ready with different skills. Some may be more ready than others. Or just different personalities, maybe some a little bit more afraid of failing than others. So whatever it is that you're scaffolding for, you may not realize that yet, but knowing that scaffolds are going to benefit all students in one way or the other, and some likely more than some of your other students. So what I mean by that is if you have an assignment where you have someone who's not afraid to ask you questions, they're not afraid to send an email to clarify what the assignment description means, and they're feeling relatively confident that you're going to be available to give them feedback because they've already established communication, they may be okay diving in straight away with only 2 weeks to do this difficult assignment. But if you have someone else who doesn't realize that maybe it's okay to reach out to their professor, maybe there's a comfort level that's not there. They consider that a very formal relationship and they don't feel comfortable. They may not seek the support they need to get started. and they might really struggle finishing an assignment like that. Whereas if you build in a draft assignment, or you give some time in class where you're circulating and giving students the opportunity to ask questions, you're building in those scaffolds so that you can meet every student's needs, even though you don't know what those needs are yet. So I think that's one piece of it. And then obviously scaffolding the difficulty piece, which I feel like we both have a lot to say about.
Yeah. The only thing I would piggyback off of what you said is peer review is a great option here as well, because part of the unspoken curriculum is that you don't have the connections that that second generation and legacy students have, and so you basically have a real opportunity for students to learn from each other and to have this kind of working relationship and bring people into the fold a little bit more with the peer review, especially if it's in draft formats, right? Because then students can then make the appropriate adjustments to the writing prompts that they have, right? Um, I would just add also that I think choice-based assignments and assignments that have multiple modalities of learning is another big one that I think fits into especially scaffolded assignments, where you can really get a sense of, is a student biting off more than they can chew? Do they need to read, do they need to rethink their thesis? Do they need to clarify their thesis a little bit more? Things of that nature. But students have a variety of backgrounds, and so someone might not have as strong a writing skill, but they might have real developed artistic sense that they could bring to still demonstrate that understanding of the materials in a way that they obviously want everyone to have great writing skills, but there are ways in which that if the writing skills are not part of this particular course's objectives, that you could implement some choice-based and multimodality assignments in as well. Faculty members bristle at the idea of flexible due dates, and there's a lot of anxiety about the idea of flexible due dates, or allowing students to redo assignments, things like that. What kind of reasons would there be for using flexible due dates, and what kind of benefits do students have, and what kind of benefits would faculty have to having those flexible due dates?
Yeah, and I think part of scaffolding and understanding how to break down an assignment is understanding what students shouldn't be able to do without support, given the level of your course and the content and where they're at. And if they haven't mastered the content enough to produce something in one format, maybe they have in another format where they feel more comfortable, which giving them some choice allows them to show what they know along the way. And Vygotsky, his theory of the zone of proximal development, I really like thinking of that. Like, what can they do on their own? What do they need to do with assistance? And if they need that assistance, then how do you provide that support? And that really helps you think about, well, how do I need to chunk this? Or what kind of additional content do I need to post on the Canvas site so that they have access to that as they go along? Or where do I make myself more available because I know this is going to be a part where they're all going to have questions. So I like thinking of it like that. And then the other piece is flexibility when you're asking students to do challenging work is really important wherever you can build in flexibility. Because if it's truly challenging, they might experience a roadblock along the way that they didn't expect, and it might throw off how they had planned to have something done by a deadline you had set, for an example. So certain flexible policies, such as due date policies, those you might be hearing about that for the first time, but really thinking about what purpose due dates serve in the course and what purpose they serve for students, and looking at if there's an opportunity to build in flexibility. I can give a personal example of teaching senior level English to 131 senior students. And I had just always thought every essay has a due date and everybody turns in their essay at the same exact time. And then you need to give students feedback in a reasonable time frame while you've probably already moved on to a brand new unit. And even just thinking about myself, how is that serving me as the instructor who is trying to provide valuable feedback to have 131 essays come in at the same time? And for the students who were sending me emails saying they would benefit from more time, what advantage was there to not allowing that for those students other than there's a deadline. We have to meet the deadline. What does that mean? So it's going to be different, I think, for every instructor, given what they have to get done and their syllabus and their agenda. But anywhere you can look at flexibility and re-examine what the policies are and what's the purpose of those, I think is beneficial when you're talking about rigor. So yeah, beyond that example, I mean, the flexibility with different policies for students, it does a lot to reduce stress. And you never know who your students are. We never know what they're dealing with. And especially students who aren't the traditional full-time enrolled student who might have work, they might have other things going on. If there are really strict policies around deadlines, for example, that might cause a student who has work, who has a family emergency, something else going on, to be tempted to cheat or do something that's going to minimize the consequences of whatever that policy is. So, for example, if they don't turn in a paper by this exact time, they're going to receive a 0. That might be a reason that a student who has a bunch of other unexpected things going on and they weren't able to get that paper in on time to turn to something else to try and get that paper done.
Right, like formatting to a different font size or word
Yeah,
padding, those type of things. Yeah,
exactly. Or
not necessarily
reaching,
cheating, but yes.
yeah, just looking for anything that's going to keep them from, probably failing that class. That's a really big consequence there. And I think there's an opportunity when there's flexibility for students to learn valuable communication skills. It doesn't mean that that you can ask for anything. It's just it makes it more human because there might be something that happened and you can send an email and you can ask the question, you can explain your circumstance, and then you can see what you get back. So it's not like you have to spell out to exactly what extent you're going to be flexible in the syllabus, but anywhere where you can show students that you are human, you understand that, and if there is an issue, you want to talk about it and negotiate it within reason. That's what that flexibility, I think, is what we're promoting, not there's no guidelines and you're never going to get these papers in on time for you to be able to grade them. That's definitely not what we're promoting.
I can speak on a personal note that has definitely been my experience. I've definitely been a person who struggled to get assignments done in time, so a lot of times I was rushing to print things in the minutes between classes, or like to finish things, and so there's a lot of word padding, a lot of um, you know very quick citations and things like that aren't necessarily cheating, but they are lessening my experience, right? Lessening my demonstration of understanding of the topics. And I do think that a lot of times when I had that happen, where it was a do or die hand in this paper right now kind of situation, as opposed to one where I could either do a rework or potentially ask for a couple more days, because I was an untraditional student, I was a first generation, I have neurodivergency. There was a lot of issues that kind of led to all that happening. Was a situation where whenever I ran into the situation where one of those papers was turned in because I had to do it and do it in a rushed way, I really was cheating myself a little bit because I didn't have the time to fully develop my ideas, to fully engage with the topic. And so I was going through that thing we mentioned earlier about the checklist of going through the checklist of items that need to be in this paper, as opposed to having some kind of personal ownership over the paper. And the times where I did have that extra time or that extra opportunity or that extra scaffolding, that really led to a deeper understanding and a deeper appreciation of the work I was doing.
I really appreciate you sharing that, because I feel like it's just such a good example of everything that when we say flexibility with some of these policies, of the benefit of it. And, this avoiding a one size fits all, because none of our students are the same. And when you have that kind of one size fits all approach, that maybe you don't have it, but your syllabus has communicated it. And so students don't get to see that you're willing to work with them because of some of these really strict policies. It can lead to a lot of anxiety. It can lead to, if a student messes up once, they feel like they probably won't be able to catch up. They might disappear. You might wonder, well, where's their work? Where have they gone? And it might just be from something that's being communicated through a syllabus or something like that. And if you can build in flexibility in different ways, you foster this growth mindset in your course, that a student who might be struggling with time management, after communicating with you, making a plan, they are able to learn this foundational skill that's going to be transformative for them beyond the content area. So even if your course wasn't on their career track, on their academic track, like, they will probably always remember that they learned this skill from going through your course. So I think there's so much power in being flexible with some of these policies.
In the first episode of the series, Terry Horton and Hedl Thacker talked a little bit about contract grading and ungrading and things like gamification, as a way of creating alternative grading methods. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, because I know that you've worked on courses where this is definitely the case, where you have that level of rigor, but have one of these alternative grading policies. Like, what kind of considerations have to go into that?
A lot. um, so I will say it's not like it's easier, like you're not grading. You're almost grading the skill development. And I would point to a course that I've worked with, the Immigrant Justice Lab course. It's cross-listed between the law school and history. And so there are 2 law students involved and 2 undergraduate students who are on a team. So they have team-based learning in teams of 4. And they basically are treating these students like professionals. They are writing a real asylum brief for a real client. They're working with an attorney from a community partner. So they're doing extremely challenging work. And at no point are they focused on a grade. They are focused on producing this work that this client needs, that this attorney needs by a certain time. Every team, their deadlines have to be flexible because of new information that might be coming out from the client that completely changes their approach that they have to take. So some are doing rewrites constantly while others are, their information stays consistent. So there's nothing there about, the amount of work at the same amount of time and everybody has to do the same thing. It can't be that way. But what they rely on is the student leader to be using the surveys that students take about how they're doing with their work, if they're accountable to it. Their peers review them as well. It's anonymous, but then that team leader meets with the instructors, and they have a conversation about the health of the teams and where they're at and what challenges. They get coaching from the professors before going back to their team and then fulfilling that leadership role of trying to lead their team to solve any challenges that are going on. So all of this, yes, receives a grade at the end. Like, did we have the meetings? Did you try the recommendation? But there's so many very challenging situations that these students are in, where they're not thinking of the grade. It does become a incomplete kind of deal. Because really what is valuable is their reflection on it at the end. And what did we learn from this?
I'm also reminded of a course that we both worked on that was a gamification course.
Yes.
That was a language course that the idea behind the gamification was to push students to engage with the materials more deeply, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that the idea is that this is a challenging course that they need to be present for, right? That they need to. It's an intensive language course that they're going to be there multiple hours a week, more so than other courses. And so they're gonna have to dive into this or full throatedly, like get into the weeds of the course. And so what we helped them with, as far as like figuring out how to balance all of this, was the logistics of the attendance policies had to be weighted against the points that were given in assessments and in their participation and in their effort and their demonstration of their abilities and their growth of their abilities over time, not necessarily them being able to navigate tough exams, or that they had to just be there, right? That there was a rationale behind the attendance policy, behind the quizzing policy, behind the participation, in driving them to have a growth over the course of the semester, and to using the kind of gamified elements of the building points to give students the opportunity and flexibility to really achieve high or be able to catch up if they needed to, right? So yeah, I think this idea of like flexibility and of having challenging work is not like it goes hand in hand with these other concepts that we've talked about in the other episodes. Like we talked about I don't know if you want to go into authentic assessments, but we also talked about that in episode 2, and how that can kind of tie into this idea of challenging work and the idea of like having a holistic view of the course objective with these elements in mind.
Yeah, and for those who are joining us for this third session, maybe you'll go back to the first and the second episode, just so you're aware of authentic assessment. This is, when we say authentic assessment, we refer to activities that require the application of knowledge and skills in real world situations or problems. So you're not really testing knowledge that students have. You're testing whether or not they can use skills that they're going to need to use, again, in jobs and careers or in any real world setting, maybe later in their academic trajectory. And what you're assessing are those high level skills. So students have to make judgments. They have to innovate or create. They have to use their knowledge and skills. And so some of the knowledge you might require that be automatic, that they've studied and memorized that. And other times you might say, you're always going to have the ability to use a tool for this. So just use your tools. What's really important here is that you're using that knowledge in a way that is allowing you to make judgments or to do the creative aspect of what the discipline requires. And you're really trying to simulate those real world situations with the assessments you create. So thinking about the eventual workplace of the student can help you think of what some of those assessments should look like. And it gives students the opportunity to practice, to get feedback, to refine their performance, to get better at something, which is highly motivating. That's what makes learning fun. Not just to receive a score on a high stakes exam and feel like either you cut it or you didn't. So I think trying to think of what motivates learners is really important when you're thinking of the value of authentic assessment.
Off the top of my head, I can think of things like model governments or mock juries or product pitches. But what other things would fit into this category of authentic assessment?
Yeah. One One project that I've worked with, like a reoccurring approach to this, is engaging students in public scholarship. So, actually engaging students in the humanities in some research that's going to be public facing, that's going to answer a question that will have a direct impact to the community. And there are a lot of courses who have WordPress sites or different websites that feature the student research that they've done, the scholarship, and students can see the direct impact that their academic work is having.
That's incredible. A bit about how instructors can utilize these concepts, but I think it's helpful to know also who this benefits, right? We've already talked a little bit about that it can help instructors because it can help them really define their course objectives and really define what students are learning and how they're learning, and to be able to structure their courses in a much more authentic way. But um, what kind of students are benefited by this work of making things more academically rigorous and using more flexibility in policies?
Yeah, so students with additional responsibilities beyond what we might think of a traditional student having. For example, students who are parents, students who have to fulfill a financial role in their families. That means that they have to work outside of school, so their schedules are going to be really demanding. Transfer students who are coming in with a different experience from their previous school, and that process is also difficult for them. International students, disabled students, neurodivergent students, and our student athletes who have extremely demanding schedules as well. Sometimes we don't think of them, but all of these students have added responsibilities where they're going to benefit from the flexible policies. They're going to benefit from the lack of logistical barriers. And then for students who need more support, an instructor who's coming in with the mindset that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, that scaffolds need to be in place for everyone to be successful. They're already going to have those systems built in that will benefit not just students who need additional support. Every student needs additional support at some point.
Mhm.
So I do think that every student benefits from this approach.
It's a proactive way of accommodating students without having them go through whatever student support organization necessary to create those accommodations, right? So, yeah, I mean, being able to have a test that is not logistically difficult but is academically difficult helps not just the normal the typical students, but it also helps the students that would normally need more time on a test, right? It would also help the students that would normally have distraction issues during tests, things of that nature.
Exactly. If you have a challenging assessment, um, that is asking still students to demonstrate skills that they've built and not just knowledge that's available, you can make that into a take-home assessment and give a large chunk of time, and that's going to already, as you mentioned, accommodate so many students who would otherwise have to go through these difficult systems to navigate. Um, because they can control how much time they can take on that, where they're going to take that test in a way that's going to benefit them and allow them to focus. And you have the reassurance that once it's testing skills. They should be using their resources. They should be drawing on tools and seeing if they can apply everything that you've taught them.
Yeah, I would also add that a lot of students come to the University of Michigan that are not traditional high school students to college, right? That they're students who've taken a couple of years off, who've come back, later in their 20s, who may have undealt with issues from their first time through college, right?
Mm.
Who, if they come up against logistical issues, they might fold, out of just, their response to how they had things happen to them in the past. You never know what students are going to be coming to that course with. And if you can make a welcoming but challenging environment, that's going to push people to want to achieve as opposed to survive to achieve.
Hmm. And what you just said made me think of students I've talked to who've been in the workforce before coming to university, and how they've already experienced kind of reasonable human flexibility within a professional environment. And then they come in as students, and it's a little bit jarring to feel like all of that vanishes in some cases. And just sometimes just the reflection of, but this isn't the real world. And so this going back to this idea of authentic assessment, trying to model or simulate the real world experience of doing these challenging things with others, collaboratively, negotiating, all of those foundational skills that come with that.
Hmm. So, what are some reflections that that an instructor listening to this might want to consider as far as their next steps go?
I think the first would be looking at policies. We've talked a lot about policies and what purpose they serve. So, to find that out for yourself, you can ask yourself, what kind of classroom climate is this policy going to foster? Um, you can also think about the rationale for some of those policies. Do you have strict deadlines because you have to get feedback to students by a certain time? That's a really strong rationale for that. But if you don't have a strong rationale for some of those policies, then reflecting on what purpose they serve and what kind of climate they create and how they impact the student learning experience. Do students have enough time to get things done? Do they have enough time to reflect after they've learned before moving on? Because metacognition is a huge piece of what is going to create a significant learning experience for students. Um, and then thinking about the workload. So, again, looking at students who are non traditional, thinking of what their schedule might look like, trying to be empathetic to that, um, and not just having in your head the traditional student who might be able to manage a really heavy workload. And then can you explain how your learning activities and assessments connect to what students are going to be asked to do after your course, in a later course, in the workplace? So again, that relevance piece. So those are just a few questions I think that instructors can reflect on after they've listened to this conversation. And would you add any others to that?
The one thing that I would add is to challenge instructors to think about how different modalities and different media types might be useful for students to be able to demonstrate the mastery of their learning objectives, aside from the traditional essay and exam. So thinking about things like multimedia presentations, websites, something like story maps or something like a podcast, ways in which that students can still express that mastery, but that don't necessarily use the traditional exam and paper way. There are definitely ways that they can do that. And I will say, not just the answer to that question, but to all the ones that you've presented that I hope instructors do think about after listening to this. If they want to talk to somebody about that, they can definitely reach out to us. You can call us 50100 or email us at lsatechnologyservices@umish.edu. We have one-on-one consultations that we can set up to talk you through all of the ins and outs of designing or redesigning your course or a particular assignment within a course, or how these policy changes might affect your course going forward. And we'll work with you on that kind of, and potentially even work with you on getting things like funding if it's a drastic change to the course, things of that nature. So I do want to thank you all for listening to our episodes on this seminar series on assessments, and I hope we'll do this more in the future. This was really helpful, I think, for everybody to go through these. Thank you, Caroline, for being with us today.
Yep. Thank you, Sean. And thank you to everyone who tuned in and listened to this episode.